This is part 2 of a two-part comparison of the King James Version Bible, or KJV, known more recently and especially in the United Kingdom as the Authorized Version, a comparison of the King James with the English Standard Version, or ESV, which was first published in 2001. In part 1, I provided some background on the two translations and followed that with a look at a few Old Testament passages where the translations differ because the ESV relies on the Dead Sea Scrolls, or the Septuagint. This video will concentrate on the New Testament with occasional glances at the Old. I'll provide some evidence that the King James Version is more literal. Then we'll move on to some New Testament passages where the translations differ because the ESV relies on modern critical editions of the Greek, while the King James was translated based mostly on what's called the received text, or Textus Receptus. I'll argue that although the KJV is usually easy to read, there are exceptions. I'll show some examples of where I think it could be improved for readability. There are a few errors in the KJV, and sometimes it's misleading. I like the archaic plural pronouns in the KJV, and I'll show how they can be useful. One of the hits against the ESV and against other modern translations like the New American Standard Bible, the New International Version, and the Christian Standard Bible is that they are, quote, New Age, unquote, Bibles, altered to look more like Catholic Bibles. I'll show examples where the KJV is the one that agrees with the Catholic Bibles. Finally, I'll say a few words about other features you might want to take into consideration before choosing a translation, and I'll show you a summary. In my opinion, the King James Version is generally more literal than the ESV. One example of where this is true is in 2 Peter 2:5, where the ESV has God preserving Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others. The KJV says that God saved Noah, the 8th person, and although that rendering is somewhat ambiguous, it is closer to the Greek, which reads, but the 8th Noah. As a second example, we'll take a look at Matthew 5:22. The ESV says that whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council. But the ESV's footnote B states that the Greek verb rendered insults is actually says Raca to, but that's what the KJV has in its text. Matthew 10:27 will serve as our third example. The ESV quotes Jesus as saying, "What you hear whispered, proclaim on the housetops." But the Greek here is literally, "What in the ear ye hear," which is what the KJV has in its text, reordered a bit for English readers. In Galatians 3 verse 22, the KJV has, "by faith of Jesus Christ," while the ESV has, "by faith in Jesus Christ." The KJV's relatively literal rendering has the advantage of being ambiguous. It allows the reader to decide whether the words mean by faith in Jesus Christ, as the ESV has it, or by Jesus Christ's own faithfulness, which is similar to what you'll find in the NET Bible. Of course, it would have been easy to find a few passages where the ESV is more literal than the KJV, such as any verse where the KJV has "God forbid," or the Greek is more like "may it never be." Nevertheless, I'm fairly confident that the KJV is more literal than the ESV in the New Testament, because I selected 200 verses at random and described them as outlined on this chart. Over these 200 verses, the KJV took fewer liberties with the text than the ESV. Out of 18 translations I've scored, the KJV is the third most literal. The ESV is sixth, being a bit more literal than its parent, the Revised Standard Version. Now I'll show you a series of charts that describe differences between the KJV and the ESV in the New Testament because they translate a different underlying Greek text. Although the ESV and KJV New Testaments have the same books in the same order, their contents differ a bit. For instance, the ESV surrounds the end of the book of Mark and the story of the woman taken in adultery in John's Gospel in double square brackets. In each case, it does so because early manuscripts don't include the passage. In other cases, such as the doxology at the end of the Lord's Prayer, "For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever," it omits a group of words from the text and places them in the footnotes. In still other cases, the ESV omits text without signaling the omission with a footnote, such as the words about the Father, Word, and Holy Spirit being one in 1 John 5:7. The KJV omits words too, such as the language about growing up unto salvation in 1 Peter 2:2. So why do the translations differ in these ways? They differ because the Greek text being translated is different. The ESV is based on the Greek text of the Nestle-Aland 28th edition, which it shares with the United Bible Society's 5th edition. This is a modern, critical Greek text that tends to reflect readings in the oldest extant manuscripts. The KJV is also based on edited editions of the Greek New Testament, but these were produced back in the 1500s. These texts are known as the Textus Receptus, or TR, and are very similar to the majority of manuscripts of the Greek New Testament preserved in the Eastern Roman Empire, which fell to Turkish invaders in 1453. While the TR is similar to the majority of manuscripts, it differs from them in a number of passages. I briefly show a few of them here. Feel free to pause the video if you'd like to examine this chart in detail. Although I've been reading about this topic for a few decades, I don't have a strong opinion, although I do lean toward the first approach shown on the slide, though perhaps with less emphasis on the earliest manuscripts and more on the unambiguous witness of early Christian writers. To keep the video from being overly lengthy, I'm not going to walk through this chart or the next one, but I will say that it seems to me that TR advocates have the weakest position. Again, pause the video if you'd like to read the charts. Meanwhile, I'll move on to the first in a series of comparisons that show additional differences between the KJV and the ESV due to the different underlying Greek texts. In Acts 9, verses 5 and 6, the King James Version includes the words in blue on the left. Those words do not appear in either the Nestle-Aland 28th edition or in the majority text. In his textual commentary, Metzger states that, so far as is known, no Greek witness reads these words at this place. They have been taken from Acts 26:14 and 22:10 and are found here in codices of the Vulgate. And the words in blue are found in the Catholic Douay-Rheims and Knox translations, which are based on the Latin Vulgate. Before we leave this page, let me point out that the words in blue are also not represented in the Greek text published by the Patriarch of Constantinople in 1904, which is known as the Patriarchal text. In our next passage, Acts 24, verses 6 through 8, we see another instance of the KJV inserting words not found in either the most ancient manuscripts or in the majority of manuscripts. But the textual case for including these words is stronger than that for including the words in Acts 9. Notice that the ESV repeats the words in blue in a footnote here, while no such footnote appeared in Acts 9. The words in blue on the left do appear in many Greek manuscripts, and they are also present in several old translations, not just in the Latin this time. Lamsa's translation of the Syriac includes language very similar to the text in blue, and John Chrysostom, who flourished in the 4th and early in the 5th century, wrote about the accusation against Lysias in his 50th homily on the book of Acts. If you have access to the Nicene and Post-Nicene Fathers series, take a look at volume 11 of the first series, page 297, right-hand column. With all that said, it should come as no surprise that the words in blue on the left are represented in the patriarchal text of 1904. A footnote in the NET Bible says that there is no easy explanation as to how such could be missing from what it calls the better witnesses. Metzger calls the words in blue the Western reading, and he points out that it changes the one to be examined from Paul to Lysias. Metzger says, "It is difficult to account for the omission of the disputed words if they were original." Another famous difference is found here in Colossians 1:14, where the KJV inserts a short prepositional phrase that the ESV omits without footnote. Here again the material in blue appears in many Greek manuscripts and ancient translations, but not in the oldest and not in the majority. It appears to have been inserted from Ephesians 1:7. Metzger writes, If the phrase had been present originally, there would have been no reason for scribes to omit it. The NET Bible says that the manuscript testimony for the shorter reading is quite overwhelming. I looked in Chrysostom's homily on this passage, and his text seems not to have included through his blood. Take a look at the first series of the Nicene and Post-Nicene Fathers, Volume 13, page 267. The patriarchal text of 1904 also does not include through his blood here. The next passage is in the prologue to John's Gospel. This is the passage that starts with, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That same Word became flesh and dwelt among us." The prologue ends with a verse on the screen. One difference between the KJV and the ESV has to do with how to translate the Greek word monogenes. The older translations used only begotten, while newer ones opt for only or sometimes only son. The other difference is due to the underlying Greek text. There are 3 well-attested variants in the Greek at this point, 2 of which are similar to each other and include the word God. The third does not and has son instead. 2 ancient papyri, P66 and P75, both have God here, though they read slightly differently. The uncials Vaticanus and Sinaiticus also have God. Metzger argues for the reading God in his textual commentary, as does a footnote in the NET Bible. But the reading in the KJV also has a great deal of early manuscript evidence supporting it, as well as versional and patristic evidence. The Hodges-Farstad majority text and the Robinson-Pierpont Byzantine text form both read son, as does the patriarchal text. The Tyndale House Greek New Testament also chose to go with the reading son here, and Athanasius, Patriarch of Alexandria, that 4th century champion of Christ's deity, regularly quoted this verse with the reading son. In Revelation 8:13, the question is whether an angel or an eagle flew through the midst of heaven, saying, "Woe, woe, woe to those who dwell on the earth." The evidence here is strongly in favor of eagle, although angel does appear in a minority of the manuscripts preserved in the Eastern Roman Empire, and in 1 9th century uncial, the majority of manuscripts read eagle, and so that's the reading in Robinson-Pierpont and Hodges-Farstad. Not surprisingly, it's also the reading in the patriarchal text. The oldest manuscripts read eagle, as does the Douay-Rheims, based on an edition of the Latin Vulgate. Lamsa's translation from Syriac also reads eagle. This example seems to be discussed with some frequency on Dr. James White's dividing line. The choice here is between "and shalt be" and "O Holy One." In this instance, some editions of the Textus Receptus actually read the Holy One in agreement with the ESV. The Holy One is also the reading in Thessalonian 28th edition and UBS 5, as well as in the Robinson-Pierpont Byzantine text form. Hodges-Farstad and the Tyndale House Greek New Testament both have holy rather than Holy One. As evidence of early versions, I point out that the Douay-Rheims, based on an edition of the Latin Vulgate, reads the Holy One in Revelation 16:5. Lamsa's translation of the Syriac has "O Holy One." The patriarchal text has the Holy One. The KJV has reportedly followed Beza's 1598 edition of the Textus Receptus here. There appears to be some controversy over how Beza came up with "and shalt be." What one normally hears is that Beza simply made it up, but recently, if I understand him correctly, Dr. Jeff Riddle has argued that in fact Beza found that reading in a manuscript. From my perspective, even if we grant that Beza found the reading in an actual manuscript, given all the evidence for holy or the Holy One, the decision at the end of the day has to go against "and shalt be." I asserted without proof in part 1 of this video that the King James Version is generally quite easy to read, and I haven't changed my mind. But generally doesn't mean always, and there are passages that are nearly inscrutable in the King James Version. I start with this passage from 1 Corinthians 6, verses 11 through 13. Now, if you understood what Paul meant the first time you read this passage in the King James Version, my hat's off to you. For my part, I found it something of a puzzle. The ESV is much easier to understand. Another hard passage is in Galatians 4, verses 17 through 18. The word affect, A-F-F-E-C-T, is not used in the King James Version in the way we use it today, and that causes some confusion. I can remember trying to read through the book of Job in the King James Version about 45 years ago and finding it quite difficult in places. Here is an example from Job 34. Verses 5 and 6 are pretty obscure on the left, but the ESV clarifies them nicely. So far in part 2 of the video, we've looked at how literal the two translations are, their different text bases in the New Testament, and 3 passages where the King James Version is a bit difficult to read. We move on now to passages where, in my opinion, the King James Version offers a translation that is either incorrect or at least misleading. Our first stop is in 2 John verse 3. The KJV has be, but modern versions like the ESV have will be. KJV seems simply to be following in the path of earlier translations like the Geneva Bible, which also had be here in verse 3. But the Greek verb is clearly future tense. Did the Lord appear to Abraham in the plains of Mamre, or by the oaks of Mamre? The 1560 and 1599 Geneva Bibles put plain of Mamre in the text, but added a side column note that presented oak grove of Mamre as an alternative translation. My lack of Hebrew and Latin is a handicap to me here, but some suggest that the KJV's translation, plains of Mamre, may have been influenced by Jerome's translation of the Hebrew into Latin. The Douay-Rheims has vale here, and a vale is like a miniature plain. All the modern translations I'm aware of prefer to refer to some species of tree here, rather than to a plain or to a valley. In Matthew 13, verse 42, the King James Version has, "There shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth," but it isn't clear where that wailing and gnashing will occur. The ESV is very specific in locating the wailing and gnashing of teeth to the fiery furnace. The Greek is very clear also. It says that the wailing and gnashing occur there, in that specific location. That rules out the possibility that the ones wailing and gnashing their teeth are doing so out of sympathy for the people cast into the furnace. The people cast into the furnace are also wailing and gnashing their teeth there. Next we come to Luke 18, verse 12. Did the Pharisee in his boastful prayer say that he gave a tithe of all that he possessed, or of all that he gained? The Greek backs the English Standard Version's translation. The Greek words come into English as much as I acquire. Next we come to Mark 11, verse 17. Jesus cast out those who bought and sold in the temple. He overthrew the tables of the money changers. Then he quoted Isaiah 56, verse 7. And the question before us is, does the passage read, "My house shall be called of all nations the house of prayer"? Or does it say, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations"? The KJV footnote here is better than the KJV text, but this is not an original KJV footnote. Suppose Jesus were pointing out that all nations will call the temple a house of prayer, as the King James Version implies. It isn't clear how that fact should alter anyone's behavior. But if Jesus' point is that the temple is the house of prayer for all nations, because it contains a court for the Gentiles, the very court they were profaning, his words are pertinent. The translation "for all nations" also seems to represent the Greek better, since it's in the dative case, not the genitive. The ESV reads more like the Geneva Bible, which has the house of prayer unto all nations. At first glance, this chart may seem strange, since the word I've highlighted is the same in both the KJV and the ESV, but that word should be different. Remember that the ESV translate the Nestle-Aland 28th edition, which has the same Greek text as the United Bible Society's 5th edition. It translates the Greek word eis, which normally comes into English as unto, into, or for. Sometimes the New American Standard Bible translates it with the awkward expression, with a view to. The KJV translates the Textus Receptus, which does not have eis here. It has in, epsilon nu. That little Greek word is normally translated with in, on, among, or by, or because of, when it's used causally. The Dean Burgon Society is dedicated to defending the KJV as, quote, as a true, faithful, and accurate translation, unquote. But in Dean Burgon's view, the KJV should have had in thy kingdom here. He called the KJV's wording at this point, quote, a palpable mistranslation, unquote. In Hebrews 2:1, the KJV pictures the author and his audience as allowing the things they have heard to slip away. The ESV depicts them as drifting away from the things they've heard, which is correct. The Greek supports the ESV. The KJV seems to have followed earlier translations like the 1560 Geneva Bible, but the 1599 Geneva Bible and several more modern translations are better here. In Romans chapter 1, verse 5, the question is whether Paul received apostleship for obedience to the faith, which is the reading in the King James text, or for the obedience of faith, the reading in the ESV text and the KJV footnote. The KJV text gives the impression that the faith is a kind of law to which obedience is due. The ESV is superior here because it leaves exactly what is meant ambiguous. The obedience of faith could be an obedience that consists of faith, an obedience characterized by faithfulness, or an obedience that is the result of faith. David Bentley Hart translated this phrase obedience of faith as consent to faith. I usually find that it's the KJV that translates ambiguous Greek phrases with ambiguous English ones, and I like that approach. Here, it's the other way around. In Matthew chapter 2, verse 16, the King James and English Standard Versions differ by a factor of about 2. To put it another way, Herod, in the King James Version, is about twice as bloodthirsty as he is in the English Standard Version, since he has all the children killed, not just the boys. Since the Greek is masculine, it seems to me that male children, or boys, is preferable. The New King James Version and the New American Standard Bible have male children here. But the translators of the New Revised Standard Version and the NET Bible both have children at this spot, just like the King James. In 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 4, we have an instance where the meaning of a word has changed. To us, nephews and grandchildren mean different things, but it wasn't always so. The word nephews used to mean grandchildren, so that the two translations actually agree. The Greek word here can mean grandchildren, or the more general term, descendants. The problem is, when reading the King James, it's not likely you'll realize that the word nephews has changed its meaning. The Trinitarian Bible Society's Westminster Reference Bible has marginal notes that explain the meaning of many archaic words and expressions, but there is no such marginal note here in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 4. The Schuyler Canterbury includes an appendix entitled King's English, which is a glossary of terms used in the King James Bible, but it doesn't include an entry for the word nephew. It seems to me that it would be wise to read a modern translation or commentary alongside the King James Version, to keep us from thinking that we understand the KJV when we really don't. Modern translations employ something called the Granville Sharp rule, a rule of Greek grammar that deals with phrases like these in Titus chapter 2, verse 13, and 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 3. By following that rule, the ESV and other modern translations make it clear that these verses state that Christ is God and Savior. The KJV leaves Christ's deity unclear in these verses, since it implies that two persons, Christ and God, are in view. Now we'll move on to a few examples of where the KJV's distinction between thou, thee, and thine on the one hand, and you, ye, and your on the other can be helpful. When I read Isaiah 40 verse 1 in the ESV, I can't tell with anything like certainty if comfort is a noun or a verb. I'm also not at all sure, if it's a verb, which is much more likely, who is supposed to be doing the comforting. The KJV is helpful here. The words you, ye, and your are plural in the King James Version. By introducing ye explicitly, the KJV makes it conclusive that the word comfort is used as a verb here, and that multiple people are supposed to do the comforting. The commentaries seem to think that ye here refers to the prophets. The ESV admits that the modern English word you is ambiguous. You can't tell whether it's singular or plural. Take this example from Luke chapter 22, verses 31 and 32. In the King James, it's obvious that in verse 31, Jesus is speaking to multiple people because it uses the plural pronoun you. Similarly, in verse 32, it's obvious Jesus is speaking to Simon Peter specifically because the King James uses thee, thou, and thy. But what about the ESV? Looking at the text itself, you can't tell because it uses the modern ambiguous you, which can be either singular or plural. The ESV translators realize you can't tell whether you is singular or plural, so they include a footnote. A similar switch happens in John chapter 3, verses 11 and 12. In the first line, you is singular, but the following times the word you is used, it's plural. The ESV straightens out the confusion with a footnote, but the difference is obvious in the King James Version. The is singular, ye and you are plural. You can find many other examples like this by skimming the ESV's footnotes. You might think my next example is something of a stretch, and you could be right, but bear with me. The KJV's use of the possessive pronoun thine in verse 13 makes it obvious that God was speaking to an individual person when he said, "Sit on my right hand until I make thine enemies thy footstool." The ESV includes no footnote for verse 13, likely because the translators think the context makes it clear that your is singular here. Maybe they're right, but does to which imply a single person was spoken to? No. As an example, if someone asks you to which, a to which question like, to which of the birds has God given the ability to hover, the answer can include broad classes that include many individuals, like the hummingbirds. Kestrels and osprey also hover. So I find the King James Version's explicit singular thine helpful here. The use of a singular pronoun argues against any view that the author has some kind of a collective son in mind, some group he's decided to refer to with the term son. Anything that helps narrow the range of interpretations is, in my view, quite helpful. Okay, we're making progress. Next, I'll show you some examples of places where the King James Version agrees with the Catholic Douay-Rheims Bible, but the ESV doesn't. The KJV and Douay-Rheims team up in opposition to the ESV. Why does that matter? I sometimes hear it said that new translations are the result of a Jesuit conspiracy to corrupt the pure Word of God. People who make that argument cite passages where the modern translations agree with the Catholic Bible when the KJV says something different. So my point in showing you these examples is to show how that argument cuts both ways. Mark chapter 6, verse 20, the KJV and the Catholic Bible say that Herod did many things. The ESV provides a non-Catholic reading. It says Herod was greatly perplexed. Mark chapter 15, verse 39, here the KJV and the Catholic Bible depict the centurion as seeing Jesus cry out. By contrast, the ESV also mentions that Jesus cried out, but only in a footnote. In Luke chapter 9, verses 55 and 56, the KJV and the Catholic Bible include Jesus' words of rebuke. The ESV does not. The ESV places those words of rebuke in a footnote. In Luke chapter 23, verse 38, the King James and the Catholic Bibles say that the superscription on the cross was written in Greek, Latin, and Hebrew characters. The ESV places those words in a footnote. In John chapter 5, verse 4, the King James and the Catholic Bible explain how an angel stirred the water in the pool of Bethesda. The ESV puts verse 4 in a footnote. In Acts chapter 8, verse 37, the King James and the Catholic Bible include a quotation from Philip that establishes faith as a necessary condition for the Ethiopian eunuch's baptism. The ESV puts verse 37 in a footnote. Incidentally, sometimes King James Version onlyists, who tend to be Baptists, claim that modern translations omit this verse because it supports believers' baptism. But the Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church both practiced infant baptism, and their scriptures retain this verse. And it's difficult to see how this verse argues against infant baptism. It simply gives an example of an adult being required to confess his faith before receiving baptism. As far as I know, all churches do that. The verse has nothing to do with the baptism of infants. Now we enter the home stretch. I call this section Other Considerations, but you could call it miscellaneous. You might consider some of these considerations trivial, but I don't. To me, the way the text is formatted is a serious issue. Although I can use a Bible formatted like a modern novel, particularly when I intend to read it like a novel and not study it in detail. But I prefer verse-by-verse formatting because I spend most of my time with the Bible studying it in detail, not reading it like a novel. It's much easier to find verse-by-verse King James versions than verse-by-verse ESVs. To me, the placement of the references is important. I prefer them to be in the margins alongside the text or in the center column. I don't like having to chase after them down at the bottom of the page or in the lower right-hand corner. They should be arranged as closely to the associated verse as possible. You can easily find King James versions that do this. For the ESV, center column references are available in some editions, but the references are usually arranged in such a way that the references that go with the verses at the top of the right-hand column are down in the center of the page. Center column references and references in the margins alongside the text also tend to make the text columns narrow. I prefer narrow columns for the same reason I prefer a verse-by-verse format. Putting the references in the margins alongside the text has another advantage. It pushes the text columns away from the gutter into the flatter portion of the page. That's a benefit, particularly to older readers who have a shallow depth of focus. On the downside, narrow columns break up lines of poetry, create gaps between words, and make it necessary to hyphenate more words. But in my view, the benefits outweigh the costs. To me, the darkness and boldness of a font is important. It is easy to find bold King James versions. Just take a look at the text in a turquoise, a long primer, a concord, or a cameo. But ESV fonts tend to have skinny strokes, and they're sometimes printed in an ink that appears almost gray. The ESV Study Bible is a happy exception. I like to see the words that the translators supply, but which don't correspond to words in the original language. I like to see those words in italic or oblique type. I realize that the less literal a translation is, the harder it is to do that, and the ESV may be too loose for this to be practical. But I'll show a few examples of where I think the ESV would benefit from the use of the italic font. First, here's Revelation chapter 14, verse 12. We'll talk about the words in blue. The ESV has, "Here is a call for the endurance of the saints." But the Greek simply has, "Here is the endurance of the saints." By inserting "a call for," the ESV offers a plausible explanation of what the text means, but that may not be the only or the best explanation. Also, notice that there is no there in the Greek. The ESV added that for smoothness, I suppose. Just a few verses earlier in Revelation chapter 13, verse 18, something similar is found. Again, notice the words in blue, "calls for." Where the ESV has, "This calls for wisdom," the Greek is more literally translated as, "Here is wisdom." Regarding this verse, Albert Barnes wrote, "The idea is either that there would be need of a special sagacity in determining what the number of the beast or of his name was, or that special wisdom was shown by the fact that the number could be thus expressed. The ESV chooses the first option, that there is a need for wisdom in determining the number of the beast, but it removes the second possibility from view, that special wisdom was shown by the fact that the number could be expressed as 666. Next, take a look at Galatians chapter 5, verse 6. The ESV inserts the word only, but only isn't found in the Greek. If you were in a debate with a legalist and tried to argue that faith is the only thing that matters based on this verse, you would be on shaky ground. As a final example, take a look at the words in blue here in Romans chapter 6, verse 5. The Greek translates literally something like, "For if we have become grown together in the likeness of his death, certainly also we shall be of the resurrection." With the words in italics removed, the 1881 Revised Version reads, "For if we have become united with, by the likeness of his death, we shall be also of his resurrection." Setting aside issues of translation, such as whether planted together or united is better here, it seems to me that by not using italics, the ESV fails to signal the reader how elliptical the original is and how speculative the translation is. To my mind, the KJV does convey that sense. Returning from that extended look at italics or the lack thereof, let me say that I find self-pronouncing texts in Bibles very helpful. As some of you have noticed, I sometimes mispronounce words. Self-pronouncing text helps me avoid doing so. There is a great deal of free study material available in the King James Version, and much of it corrects the KJV's erroneous interpretations. It's true that most of the free material is dated, but that doesn't mean it isn't useful. An advantage for the ESV is that because of copyright protection, it's under configuration control. By contrast, different publishers print slightly different versions of the King James text. Fortunately, the differences you'll find are minor. I consider it an advantage for the ESV that it's being corrected, but if correcting known errors makes you uncomfortable, you may disagree. If you use a wide-margin Bible, you'll find a larger selection in the King James Version. But it appears that there are more modern, high-quality study Bibles available in the English Standard Version. I'm sure we could list many more differences, such as the formatting of poetry and the use of in-text headings, but it's time to move on to the summary. Finally, here's my summary chart. To avoid being repetitive, I'll not talk through this chart, but don't be surprised by that last bullet. It was written by someone who admires the Book of Common Prayer and all of its editions prior to 1979. As always, thanks for your time. Please hit like if in fact you did like this video, and remember to subscribe if you're so inclined. Thanks again.